Hello everyone and welcome to another video. I hope you had an absolutely wonderful new year. I can't believe it's already 2020. That feels insane to me, but here we are, and I am again talking about my favorite books of the previous year. So this video is going to be me speaking all about the books I loved in 2019. These are not books that were necessarily published in 2019, but these are my favorites that I've read over the course of the last year. I have 10 books, I think, on this list, so it's a pretty reasonable list. I hope you guys really enjoyed the video, and without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in and start speaking about my favorite books of 2019. So starting way back at the very beginning of the year, the first book I'm going to speak about is Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. I borrowed this from the library way back in January 2019. This book was just spectacular and so beautifully written, and I loved it so much. Daisy Johnson is the youngest person to have ever been nominated for a Man Booker, and she was nominated with this book. Pretty much Everything Under is an Oedipus retelling. Now, if you don't know the story of Oedipus, it's a pretty dark story. It's an ancient Greek story about a young man who is a hero who pretty much sleeps with his mother and murders his father. Now, that doesn't sound very yeah, so pretty much Everything Under is an Oedipus retelling. So brilliantly done. I just loved the book. The way the author used water imagery, and she talks about like the characters living next to the river and everything sort of coming back to the river. The title of the book is quite indicative of the fact that this novel is about everything under the surface. And if you know about Oedipus, you may have heard of the Oedipus complex and Freud and us sort of repressing these things and these really popular ideas in psychoanalysis from the 1920s. So the title kind of plays on that as well, and pretty much the novel is about the things that we bury and memories coming back to us. It's so beautifully written and it's quite harrowing. So if you like contemporary lit, I definitely recommend Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. Book number 2 is Instructions by Neil Gaiman, and this is the only book I have on this list that is actually a picture book. I read this book because it was recommended to me by my writing class I was doing at the beginning of the year when I was doing my postgrad stuff. I think I've listened to this picture book maybe 50 or 60 times. I love it so much. It's like the most beautiful, lyrical, magical story. I'll link it in the description down below. Sorry guys, it's really warm in here, so I'm going to turn the aircon on, and if the audio is suddenly hecked and doesn't work anymore and is very noisy, I'm sorry, but I am dying. So I'm sorry about that, but back to the video. Instructions, Neil Gaiman, magical, and I love it. If you like poetry, if you like lyricism in stories, I definitely recommend you checking it out. 2019 was absolutely the year of Neil Gaiman for me, so look forward to more of him being on this list. But yeah, Instructions pretty much is about the instructions that a child needs to grow up, but it's kind of in a fantasy sort of way. So there's a lot of metaphor in this story about the journey that the kid takes, but it's done in a fantasy way. So it's go past the witch's house, go past the 12 months who are sitting around a fire. The months are personified in this case, and it's just so beautifully written. And if I'm in a particularly emotional mood, I will tear up listening to this story because I love it. I love it that much, so please go listen to it. Number 3 is Anne of Green Gables. I ended up reading pretty much all of the Anne books this year. I have no idea why I haven't read Anne of Green Gables before. I adore it so much. I love the TV show as well. I heard recently that they're going to be cancelling the TV show, and that's the saddest thing because I freaking love that show. But yeah, Anne of Green Gables is number 3 on my list of favorite books. If you're unfamiliar with the story, it is about a young girl named Anne. I think she's about 10 years old, maybe 11 years old at the beginning of the story. She is an orphan. She's gone through so much neglect and abuse, and she's been made to work for these awful families and stuff, but pretty much she is adopted by a brother and sister who live in Avonlea at a beautiful little farm called Green Gables, and it's about them pretty much indoctrinating her into their family, and It has this beautiful pastoral setting. It's set in Canada and like in the countryside, and it is the nature in this book is so beautiful, and I love it immensely. This book is a kid's book, but the characterization is really good and really strong, and the story is just beautiful, and everything is just excellent. I love these books. If you're into kids books, I so recommend Anne of Green Gables. I freaking love this story. I'm definitely going to reread it soon. Just a really, really good, lovely, wholesome kids book. Number 4 is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. You would have seen me reading this if you watched my reading and recovery vlog. When I got my tonsils out in like June or July, I can't remember when it was, mid-2019, I was reading this for my master's class at the time, and I was reading it in that vlog pretty much, but this is a brilliant book, again by Neil Gaiman. This is not the last Neil Gaiman book on this list. But yeah, this book is about a young boy whose parents are murdered by a man named Jack. And basically this little toddler toddles up the hill up to a graveyard to get away from the guy who's trying to murder him, who's just murdered his whole family. And he takes refuge in the graveyard, and then he is raised by the ghosts of the graveyard. And it's a really beautiful story that talks about like life and death, and it's a Bildungsroman, so like a coming of age story, and it covers pretty much Bod's journey from living in the world of the dead to coming to the world of the living. It is a beautiful story, and I'm going to say that about every book on this list, but really quite harrowing about the journey of growing up. And it, even though it was like a kid's book, it like I kind of teared up in the last chapter because it was just so emphatic and so impactful and brilliantly written. Like Neil Gaiman is such an amazing storyteller. Number 5 is Coraline, and I listened to this one on Libby. So Coraline, I saw the film when I was like 10 or something like that, and I enjoyed the film at the time but didn't love it. So since reading The Graveyard Book and really enjoying The Graveyard Book, I thought I would give Coraline a go, listen to the audio version of the book, and holy crap, I love it so much more than I loved the film. Coraline was amazing. A little bit of a different tone to The Graveyard Book, like similar age period. I feel like Coraline might be a little bit older. It has a lot of gothic themes in terms of like the house and the way the house is made, and like the mother who's like the demon of the home. And yeah, pretty much Coraline is about a young girl. She is in a flat in this house in the UK, and so you have the house and then the flat is just like one sort of snippet of one floor. So it's a big creepy old house, and she's on her school holidays and she's very bored, and she sort of takes her parents for granted. She's frustrated they won't spend time with her, and she sort of goes through this door into this other world, into the other house, and she meets her other mother, who turns out to be a very scary demon-y lady thing, and it's all very cool and very creepy. And Caroline has to get back to her own home and defeat this thing, and it's so cool, and I really love it. It's a brilliant story. I liked it more than I liked the movie. If you haven't seen, there's a Tim Burton version of Coraline. It's also really good. It's just I loved the book so much, and I thought it was brilliant. Number 6 is Mythos by Stephen Fry. This is pretty much just like retellings of the Greek myths. So beautifully written by Stephen Fry, so beautifully engaging. Like I think they would have had like a whole team of people to work on this book to comb through all of the archives of all of the Greek myths so that he could like rewrite them in such a concise and really good way. I listened to the audio version of this book, and it is like 15 hours long, which is a bit long, but clearly he wanted to have like a really comprehensive resource. My only very small gripe with it was I misinterpreted when I read the title of the book. I thought this was a book that would also contain the hero myths, because I love Atlante, and I really wanted to listen to this version of Atlante, but that's fine. He wrote a second book, which I'm going to listen to in the coming year. But yeah, pretty much retellings of all the Greek myths, really in-depth, a really good resource if you're like just coming into ancient mythology and you want to learn about it. As many of you guys may have listened to me mention before, I've studied myth a bunch of times. I did mythology and fairy tales. In 2019 I did class on it, and then I did it in my undergrad as well. Freaking love ancient mythology. It's so cool, and very, very interesting. But yeah, Mythos, the Greek myths retold, brilliant book, focuses just on the gods. There's also a sequel that focuses on the heroes. I'm really looking forward to reading that one as well. Number 7 is The Handmaid's Tale. I couldn't get over how much I loved The Handmaid's Tale. I've already read a bunch of short stories by Margaret Atwood. I knew that I liked her writing and she was brilliant, but The Handmaid's Tale is so harrowing and beautiful and impactful and just an amazing story. For those of you who aren't familiar with The Handmaid's Tale, it's a dystopian novel set in the US. Essentially, the plot of The Handmaid's Tale is this totalitarian regime has taken over, has become very, very controlling in a lot of facets of everyday life. In the case of these particular characters, the way that they've been impacted the most is they have become handmaids whose sole purpose is to produce babies for the people who are in power and the people who are the elite, who are not able to conceive children of their own. So it's sort of a book about like reproductive rights and women being forced into these things. And this novel was written in the 1980s, I believe, but it is quite terrifying how recent the novel feels. Like the way it describes this totalitarian regime taking over the US and the way it describes like all of this stuff happening feels like it's happening right now. It's really, really disconcerting how relevant The Handmaid's Tale is to right now and how the world feels and like all of this stuff. It was amazing that Margaret Atwood had this insight back in the 80s. I don't know how she did it, but it's just such a brilliant book. Number 8 is Sapiens. This one I also don't own a physical copy of. This is non-fiction and probably my favorite non-fiction book I've ever read in my entire life. Sapiens is pretty much about the history of the human race, and it covers everything from like the beginning and how we evolved and how we became who we are to like religion and why we have religion and why we've depended on religion and economics and power and how our societies have formed, and it just goes over everything and it's so good. This book was really, really long. I had to borrow it 3 times from Libby to get through it, and because it's so popular, I had to wait weeks in between each time I borrowed it, but it was outstanding and I loved it so much. It was just very, very informative. And the author, Yuval Noah Harari, just did the most amazing job of picking out the most interesting and informative and brilliant little pieces to use. I feel like I understand our history so much more because I read this book, and I loved it so much. Number 9 is The Forest of the Wool and Steel. This is a book I picked up on our recent trip to Japan. It is by Natsu Miyashita, and it is about a piano tuner in Hokkaido, like rural northern Japan, very snowy, very, very cold. I love this book so much. It's a very slow story. It's like contemporary lit, and it really doesn't cover anything other than tuning pianos. And I love the story because it's so calm and slow, and it talks about like the magic of the forest and how the forest impacts the way the piano plays, and when you play the piano you can feel the forest trees and you can see the little fireflies, or like it's so beautiful, and it's so beautifully written how it links nature and playing the piano. And I learned a lot about how pianos work and how to tune pianos from reading this book. So beautiful, brilliant story, a really slow read, but a really, really peaceful read. And then the very last book, and therefore the last Neil Gaiman novel of this list, Ocean at the End of the Lane. So brilliant. Like, I can't believe that before 2019 I had never read a Neil Gaiman book before. I knew who he was, but I hadn't read a book by him. And now almost 50% of the books on this list were by Neil Gaiman. Ocean at the End of the Lane is an adult urban fantasy novel. Pretty much is about this guy who, he is an adult coming back to his very, very like tiny hometown in country England. Sure. He comes back to where he grew up to attend a funeral, and he's in his 40s, and then he goes back to the house down the end of the lane where he used to visit where he was a child, and starts remembering all of these really, really scary things that happened to him. So it's just this very, very creepy, dark, scary novel. It's very magical. It's pretty much the novel is from the eyes of a 7-year-old child. So this 7-year-old is seeing stuff that's very scary and very adult, but it's not a kid's book in any way. Some much darker themes in this than any of the other Neil Gaiman books I've read, but so harrowing and so creepy and so brilliantly written, and I loved it so much. There were lots of so's in that sentence, I'm really sorry, but it's just a really, really good book. Probably this was my favorite of the books I read by him this year, so this was the best one. Yeah, an amazing, creepy, harrowing story, and I really enjoyed it. And that was my last favorite from my list of favorite books for 2019. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope that was a bit informative for you for books that maybe you might considering picking up this year. As I said, it was very much the year of Neil Gaiman for me. I want to massively increase the amount that I'm reading in 2020. I want to read a lot more diverse books. I want to read more non-fiction books. I want to read more genre fiction books. Pretty much, I just want to get into the swing of reading more. So my reading goal for 2020 is a lot bigger than how many books I read in 2019. Let me know what your favorite books of 2019 were. I want to put more recommendations on my reading list, so I would love to hear what your favorites were. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had the most amazing new year and have an absolutely wonderful 2020. Take care, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.